Welcome to Box Office Recaps. Today we are recapping a horror thriller movie titled The Invisible Man, which was released in 2020. Spoilers ahead. The movie opens with waves repeatedly crashing against a rock near a cliff. Then the shot pans out, and we see a residence in the distance right off the edge of a cliff. A girl named Cecilia is pretending to be asleep. She momentarily opens her eyes and checks the time. It is 3:41 a.m. She quickly gets out of bed not to rouse Adrian, her boyfriend. She pulls out a pill container from underneath the mattress. The label says diazepam. She circles the bed and picks up a glass of water as she confirms if Adrian drank it. She slowly heads to the sink and empties the glass, then to the closet, where she retrieves a travel bag from a hidden compartment. On her way out of the bedroom, she makes sure she has eyes on Adrian at all times via her phone and a security camera. She heads downstairs to Adrian's workspace. She gets on his computer to disable the cameras and house alarm. She accidentally kicks the dog's bowl on her way out. It's a tense moment as she checks her phone if Adrian is stirred in his sleep. Everything is fine. She gets appropriately dressed and heads out the garage, but is suddenly startled by the dog. She reluctantly decides to remove its collar, but in doing so, it bumps off the car alarm. Cecilia runs for the fence. It is a big compound, and Adrian's light has come on in the distance. She is running through the bushes now until finally she gets to a road. She is expecting Emily, her sister. Finally, she sees the headlights. She gets into the car but mistakenly drops her diazepam pill box on the road. Emily is concerned, but just then, Adrian appears. He forcefully shatters the car glass and tries to grab at Cecilia, but Emily manages to drive away safely. Adrian picks up the diazepam with a bloody fist. A caption reads, 2 weeks. It's morning and Cecilia is at a window. Emily's friend, Detective James, joins her and encourages her that she's safe and could at least attempt to step out of the house. She tries, but once outside, is frightened back in by a mere jogger. Emily shows up at the house later. Cecilia is unhappy with the visit because she is paranoid that Adrian can trace Emily. But then Emily is here to give her some news. It seems Adrian has died. Cecilia reads it off Emily's phone. Optics groundbreaker dead of an apparent suicide. Now, she can talk freely about the wrong things Adrian did to her. She even ventures freely outside to check the mailbox. Once back in, she chatters lightheartedly with James' teenage daughter, Sydney, and James, who thumbs through the mail. It turns out one of the letters is for her. She is slightly surprised because no one knows she is living there. Presently, she is seated in a meeting room with Emily. At the end of the big table is Tom, who is Adrian's attorney and brother. He is the executor of Adrian's last will and testament. Adrian has left Cecilia with an endowment of $5 million to be transferred in staggered $100,000 per month payments. That evening, Cecilia gifts James a new ladder and promises Sydney a college grant of $10,000 every month. They are all happy. Later on, Cecilia is alone in her room, checking out a few clothes she bought. Suddenly, she feels uneasy, but then she brushes it off. It's morning, and Cecilia has some bacon and eggs on the fire. James is off to work. He is a cop, so he has a holster and a badge on him. They talk lightly before parting. The camera shot remains in the kitchen while Cecilia leaves her cooking to go check up on Sydney. Mysteriously, we can see the stove slowly start to overheat. When Cecilia and Sydney reappear, there is a potentially dangerous fire which they eventually contain. That night, Cecilia is working late on her laptop. She suspects something is off and moves to check the house quietly. At some point, the front door opens by itself. She goes outside briefly. It is cold, and unbeknown to her, there is a strange whiff of cold breath right behind her. She quickly gets back in. Now she is asleep in a bed she shares with Sydney. Someone outside the viewer's line of vision pulls the duvet away, and what seems like a phone camera flashes a few times. Cecilia is awakened and notices there is no duvet. She finds it at the foot of the bed and is confused. She looks over the chair and imagines the cushion is depressed. She tests her theory, but it comes up negative. On her way back into bed, the invisible entity she has suspected all along stamps down on the duvet as she pulls. She screams out for James. He rushes in and reassures her. At her interview the following day, she can't find her work samples and ends up fainting. James is at the hospital with her as the doctor advises her. Later on, she is in the shower when the phone rings. It's the doctor who goes on to tell her about the high levels of diazepam in her blood. And even more, the same diazepam pill box she thought she'd lost is now right there in front of her. Someone slipped it in. James has accompanied her to Tom's office. She asks Tom to beg Adrian to stop harassing her. She even insinuates that Adrian has figured out a way to be invisible, being the optics genius. Tom tries to reassure her that he dislikes Adrian too. She goes to her sister's place next. Emily is angry at her for sending a certain hateful email. Cecilia tries to defend herself. She says Adrian was the one who sent it. Emily doesn't let her inside out of bitterness. That evening, Cecilia is depressed. It seems Adrian has access to her email account. Sydney comes into her room to console her. Just then, Sydney is mysteriously punched in the face. She cries out, and James appears to remove her from the situation. All the while, Cecilia denies she could ever hit Sydney. James and Sydney leave Cecilia in the house to her demons. Cecilia is alone now, and she tries to engage the Invisible Man. She pours some dirt on the floor and picks up a knife. She tries to communicate with the entity for a while, then she gets an idea. She calls Adrian's number and surprisingly, it rings somewhere in the same house. The ringtone is coming from the ceiling. She checks it out and finds some more evidence. Her sample drawings from earlier, a knife, and Adrian's phone with recent pictures of her all right there. The phone beeps suddenly and her attention is directed towards her entry point. Something is lurking there and she pours a can of paint to reveal a figure standing on the ladder. Once she recovers her composure, she climbs out of the ceiling and tries to trace the paint. She dares the Invisible Man. The kitchen tap is turned on suddenly, and when she puts it off, the Invisible Man attacks her. He disarms her of the knife and throws her around. She fights back by smashing some dishes on his head. Eventually, she runs out of the house and calls an Uber that drives her a long way all night back to Adrian's house. She tells the driver to wait for her. Once inside, she reunites with her dog. She quickly heads downstairs. She aims to retrieve what she thinks is the spare invisible suit. She uncovers it after a little brain racking and fiddling. The dog barks as if he's seen something. So she tries to hide the suit in a secret compartment in the closet. The Invisible Man gets there, but she evades him. As the taxi drives away, she reaches out to Emily over the phone. She wants to meet up at a public place. Emily finally arrives at the restaurant. They order some tap water, and just when Cecilia is about to tell Emily what she found at Adrian's house, there is a knife suspended in the air. It fatally slices Emily's neck and ends up in Cecilia's grasp. Patrons of the restaurant are shocked as Cecilia is taken away. She is shown being dragged through a mental facility as she screams and struggles. She is promptly sedated and left alone in her room. Before she drifts off to sleep, she hears a voice that says, "Surprise." Afterward, she is questioned by a detective. James is also in the room. She tries to tell them that she knows Adrian's secret but can't divulge it right away because Adrian is also in the room. In another scene, a nurse tells her that her blood test from earlier revealed that she was pregnant. Later on, she is taken by an orderly for a meeting with Tom in the common area. As Adrian's estate trustee, he is there to inform her of the latest developments. He quietly tells her that all her troubles could go away if she gets back with Adrian, seeing she is pregnant with his child. It is either that or being cut off financially. She refuses the offer by throwing his papers on the floor. She steals a pen from his suitcase as he tries to gather the papers, and he promises he will check back in 3 days if she changes her mind. She scans the common room. The weather girl on the news predicts a rainstorm. It is dark and rainy outside. The orderly inspects Cecilia's room and person for the night. He is satisfied and leaves. She now retrieves the stolen pen and swears that Adrian will never have her or the baby as she slashes her wrist. He tries to stop her, which goes according to her plan. She stabs him repeatedly with the pen, but he kicks her away. A security guard looks into her room and orders her to get back into bed. But then he sees the twitching figure of the Invisible Man's suit. He tries to neutralize it, but is overpowered. Cecilia runs into the corridor, but is stopped by 2 more guards who try to pull her back. The Invisible Man neutralizes both of them too, and goes on to knock off 4 other incoming guards. The Invisible Man heads outside into the night, and Cecilia follows with her gun, but not before hitting her target once. It's raining as she searches for traces of him. Finally, he appears and grabs her by the neck. He warns her that he will hurt Sydney. A guard tries to shoot at him, but he shoots back and then leaves the scene. Cecilia hijacks the car and chases after him. She calls James, informing him that Sydney is not safe at home. Back there, the Invisible Man gains access and heads towards Sydney's room. Out of fear, she is suddenly awakened. She picks up her pepper spray and uses it. A figure seems to fall to the floor, but then it recovers and tries to strangle her as she runs. James finally gets to the house and, with his firearm loaded, calls out for Sydney. He finds her on the floor, but the Invisible Man attacks him and hits him until he is unconscious. But then Cecilia arrives. She sprays him with some fire repellent and shoots at him. He staggers and falls down dead. She moves to uncover the face of the figure. It is Tom. A SWAT team is at Adrian's house, where they miraculously discover Adrian tied up and forgotten in his own basement. At James's precinct, Cecilia doubts everything. That night, she calls Adrian for a meetup. They are at the table now. She begs him to admit to all he's done. He denies, but indirectly says these magic words that shouldn't come as a surprise. Cecilia excuses herself to the powder room. Meanwhile, James is listening in from a parked car outside. Then, Adrian seemingly grabs a knife from the table and slits his throat. It is all caught on the security cam. Cecilia returns and pretends to call the police frantically, but then she gets out of the view of the security camera and repeats the taunting words, "surprise," to Adrian, who is bleeding out. James rushes to her aid. She is carrying a bag containing the spare invisible suit she hid a while ago. They meet outside. She reaches an understanding with James on the prior happenings and continues to walk on. She pauses briefly to take in her freedom. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more recaps and hit the bell icon for notifications.